Just before sunrise on February 10, 2016, federal agents quietly surrounded a house on Detroit's west side near 7 Mile Road, waiting for a young man neighbors knew as Maniac to step outside. The arrest looked routine to anyone passing through that block. Yet investigators already knew the man inside had once walked away from a murder case as a teenager. Years earlier, he had been Jerome Hamilton, a suburban kid from Southfield who somehow turned into the leader of Detroit's Rollin '60s Crips. What happened between those two moments stretched across nearly a decade of shootings, gang wars, courtrooms, street rumors, federal wiretaps, and a name that kept resurfacing whenever violence shook the West Side. Long before federal agents kicked down doors looking for Jerome Hamilton in 2016, the kid everybody called Bunchy grew up in Southfield, Michigan, a quiet suburban community just outside Detroit, where families usually pushed their children toward college. Relatives later explained that Hamilton's home environment looked stable from every angle, since both parents stayed involved while extended family members remained active throughout Detroit's professional circles. One relative even held a position on the Wayne State University Board of Governors, which showed how Hamilton moved around people who valued education rather than street reputation. That background mattered later when investigators tried explaining how someone raised inside that kind of support system eventually ended up running one of Detroit's most feared neighborhood crews. Family members described Jerome Hamilton as respectful during childhood, which meant adults around him saw a polite teenager who protected younger relatives while avoiding the loud trouble common among other boys his age. Those same relatives often remembered him attending family events, wearing school clothes, talking about sports, homework, or plans for college, while older cousins discussed their own careers. Teachers from Southfield schools remembered him as quiet rather than disruptive, which created the early picture of a kid following a typical suburban path. When federal agents later reviewed his upbringing, they kept repeating the same observation, since Jerome Hamilton did not begin life inside poverty or abandonment like many gang leaders across major cities. That reality made the later transformation harder for outsiders to understand. During the early 2000s, Detroit still carried the influence of street organizations operating across several neighborhoods, although the city mostly developed its own local gangs rather than importing outside identities. Yet, teenagers growing up during that era constantly heard stories about Los Angeles gangs through music videos, rap lyrics, magazines, plus movies that turned Crip culture into something larger than local reality. Hamilton became interested in that mythology while still attending school in Southfield, which meant the fascination began during normal teenage years rather than after dropping out or running away. Friends from those years later said he occasionally talked about Crips from California, like they were legends, repeating stories about neighborhood crews, blue flags, street codes, plus reputations earned through violence. That curiosity gradually shaped how he viewed street life around Detroit. At first, those conversations sounded like regular teenage bragging rather than a serious path toward gang involvement, since plenty of teenagers admired famous street organizations without actually joining anything dangerous. Yet Hamilton started spending more time around young men connected to Detroit's West Side neighborhoods, which meant he began moving away from the suburban routines he grew up around. The shift did not happen overnight, since relatives still believed he planned on attending college while preparing for adulthood through school. However, some people close to him later noticed small changes in his behavior, including new friends who carried themselves with the confidence common among street crews. Those influences slowly replaced earlier priorities, especially once Hamilton started hanging around areas where neighborhood reputation meant more than academic achievement. By the time he reached his mid-teens, the fascination with gang identity became more serious, which meant Hamilton started claiming connections to Crip culture while still living under his parents' roof. Detroit teenagers during that period already knew about local sets operating across the city, although the image of California gangs still carried a different level of prestige. Hamilton reportedly talked about bringing a version of the Rollin '60s neighborhood Crips to Detroit, borrowing the name from a famous Los Angeles set known for its influence across American gang culture. Even though he remained a high school student with family support around him, that idea slowly became more than just talk among friends. Younger boys began paying attention when Hamilton discussed forming his own crew. While Detroit maintained its own neighborhood rivalries, the mythology around California gangs often attracted young people who wanted instant recognition rather than slowly building local reputations. Hamilton understood that dynamic early, which meant adopting the Rollin '60s name offered credibility before any actual organization existed. Friends remembered him describing plans to build a crew on Detroit's West Side that carried the same image as the Los Angeles gang. That ambition gradually connected him with other teenagers looking for belonging, status, or protection around neighborhoods where violence sometimes determined respect. What started as a fascination soon blended with street influence across Detroit's West Side. At the same time, Hamilton still maintained the outward appearance of a student preparing for adulthood, which created a strange contrast between his suburban upbringing and growing street ambitions. Family members continued encouraging college plans, while teachers still believed he possessed the intelligence necessary for higher education. Yet those positive expectations quietly collided with the environment Hamilton started visiting more frequently around Detroit. That tension built slowly during his early teenage years, while most adults around him remained unaware of the direction things were moving. The turning point arrived during the fall of 2008, when Jerome Hamilton was still just 15 years old, still technically a high school kid living under his parents' roof while carrying a growing fascination with street reputation. Within weeks, that curiosity would explode into a crime that shocked Detroit's suburbs, placing Hamilton's name into headlines while police searched for the teenager responsible. What happened next changed his life forever, although at the time, nobody involved understood how far the consequences would eventually reach. During the evening of October 15, 2008, the Rib Rack restaurant in Lathrop Village prepared to close after another regular workday along Southfield Road just north of Detroit. The location sat inside a quiet suburban strip where late-night business rarely brought danger, which made the events about to unfold feel completely out of place. Inside the restaurant, 21-year-old Catherine Solinsky Blaine finished her shift manager duties while co-workers cleaned counters, counted receipts, and prepared to leave the building. Catherine had recently married her husband, Jason Blaine, earlier that year, while family members also knew she carried another piece of news that had not yet reached the entire world. At that moment, she was 2 months pregnant with her first child, although doctors would only confirm the pregnancy hours later after she reached the hospital. Catherine worked hard inside that restaurant during the months following her wedding, which meant most evenings ended with routine closing procedures before heading home to Southfield, where she lived with her husband. That Wednesday night followed the same pattern since employees counted the final receipts, locked the doors, then began leaving the building shortly before 11 o'clock. According to later police statements, the restaurant maintained a safety rule instructing workers to leave together after closing, since managers often carried cash deposits while walking toward their vehicles. On that particular night, Catherine stepped outside alone shortly after 11 p.m., moving across the parking lot under dim lighting while the quiet suburbs settled into late evening silence. No one inside the building realized that someone waited nearby watching those final movements. As Catherine reached her vehicle, she climbed inside the driver's seat while preparing to leave the parking lot, unaware that a gunman moved quietly through the darkness toward her car. Investigators later reconstructed the moment through witness accounts, which described a young figure approaching the driver's side while she started the engine. Within seconds, a single gunshot shattered the quiet suburban street when the shooter fired directly through the driver's window. The bullet struck Catherine in the head while she sat behind the steering wheel, leaving her gravely wounded before the vehicle even left the parking space. Her car immediately rolled forward uncontrolled across the lot until it smashed into a nearby fence behind the restaurant building. Residents living near the Rib Rack heard the crash, followed by confusion across the parking lot, which prompted several neighbors to step outside and call emergency services. Police officers arrived quickly, while paramedics rushed Catherine to Beaumont Hospital in Royal Oak, where doctors attempted emergency treatment. During those frantic medical efforts, hospital staff discovered something that intensified the tragedy surrounding the shooting. Catherine Solinsky Blaine had been 2 months pregnant at the time of the attack, a fact even some relatives did not yet know before doctors informed them at the hospital. Despite those medical attempts, she died the following day, leaving family members devastated, while the community struggled to understand how such violence struck a quiet suburb. Detectives from Lathrop Village Police immediately began examining the scene for evidence that might explain why someone targeted a restaurant manager leaving work late at night. Early reports suggested the attack could involve a robbery attempt, since closing managers sometimes carried deposits from the restaurant. However, the officers searching the car quickly noticed that Catherine's purse remained untouched inside the vehicle, while no money appeared missing from the building's safe. That detail confused investigators, who expected signs of theft if robbery served as the real motive. Without stolen cash or property, the crime scene raised more questions than answers. As the investigation moved forward, detectives reviewed surveillance footage from nearby cameras while interviewing employees who worked that evening shift. Those interviews slowly pointed investigators toward a group of teenagers who had been moving around Detroit's northern suburbs that same night. Police eventually identified 3 young men connected to the area during the hours leading up to the shooting. One name soon stood out during those early conversations, since several witnesses placed Jerome Hamilton near the scene before the fatal encounter occurred. At the time, Hamilton was only 15 years old, which meant detectives suddenly considered the possibility that a suburban teenager committed a crime, shocking the entire community. Within weeks, investigators also identified 2 additional teenagers connected to the case, including Brandon Davis and DeAndre Sturgis, who reportedly traveled with Hamilton that evening. Police began reconstructing the timeline, showing how the 3 youths drove around different neighborhoods searching for potential robbery opportunities earlier that night. According to later court testimony, the group discussed targeting locations where employees carried money after closing. Eventually, that search brought them near the Rib Rack restaurant, where Catherine Solinsky-Blaine finished her shift around 11 o'clock. The discovery that 3 teenagers might be responsible for the killing of a pregnant restaurant manager stunned both Detroit residents and law enforcement officers working the case. News reports quickly spread the story across local television stations, while newspapers printed the names of suspects only days after police filed formal charges. Prosecutors soon charged Jerome Hamilton with first-degree murder for the fatal shooting, while also pursuing cases against the 2 other teenagers linked to the robbery attempt. Suddenly, the 15-year-old from suburban Southfield stood accused of one of the most disturbing crimes Detroit's suburbs had witnessed in years. Those charges launched a legal battle that would stretch across multiple trials, while the victim's family waited for justice inside crowded courtrooms. Yet before that courtroom drama unfolded, prosecutors needed to explain exactly how 3 teenagers planned the robbery attempt that ended Catherine Solinsky-Blaine's life. That explanation began with the testimony of one young man who decided to tell investigators everything about what happened that night. As detectives continued examining the Rib Rack shooting, prosecutors later built their narrative by piecing together statements given by the teenagers involved, along with testimony that eventually surfaced inside Oakland County courtrooms. Investigators believe the night began several hours before the gunshot echoed through Lathrop Village, when Jerome Hamilton and 2 other teenagers drove around Detroit's northern suburbs searching for easy robbery targets. According to testimony presented during the trials, the group moved through several neighborhoods earlier that evening without finding anyone carrying cash or valuables worth risking an attack. Those unsuccessful attempts left the teenagers frustrated as they continued circling through suburban streets looking for something that might bring quick money. Eventually, that search led them toward the Rib Rack restaurant, where employees were preparing to close for the night. One of the central figures in explaining what happened during those hours became Brandon Davis, the 18-year-old who later took the witness stand during Jerome Hamilton's murder trials. Davis admitted he had been with Hamilton and another teenager named DeAndre Sturgis that evening, riding through neighborhoods while discussing possible robbery opportunities. During testimony, he told jurors that someone in the group mentioned the Rib Rack manager regularly left the restaurant carrying money from the day's sales. Davis said that the rumor immediately caught their attention since a closing manager would likely walk to a vehicle holding a deposit meant for the bank. According to his statement, the group then decided to drive toward the restaurant to see whether they could intercept the manager while she walked outside. Once they reached Lathrop Village, the teenagers parked nearby while watching activity around the restaurant from inside their vehicle. Davis later explained that they waited patiently while employees finished their shifts and began leaving the building one by one. The parking lot slowly emptied as workers drove away, while the teenagers remained hidden inside their car. According to Davis, the plan involved letting the final employee exit alone before attempting the robbery in the darkened lot. That moment eventually arrived when Catherine Solinsky-Blaine locked the restaurant doors shortly after 11 o'clock and stepped outside toward her vehicle. Prosecutors later used Davis's testimony to explain how the teenagers positioned themselves just before Catherine reached the parking lot. He told jurors that DeAndre Sturgis stayed behind the wheel, ready to drive once the robbery happened. Davis claimed he remained nearby, acting as a lookout while Jerome Hamilton moved closer to where the restaurant manager parked her car. As Catherine approached her vehicle, the teenagers believed the moment had arrived to confront her before she left the lot. According to Davis, the entire situation unfolded within seconds after Catherine opened the driver's door and climbed inside. Davis testified that Hamilton approached the vehicle from the driver's side while the others remained near the getaway car, waiting for the confrontation to unfold. Catherine had already started the engine when the gunman stepped toward the window. Davis later told jurors that a single shot suddenly rang out across the parking lot as the robbery attempt escalated into deadly violence. The bullet passed through the driver's side window while Catherine sat behind the steering wheel, preparing to drive away. That moment transformed what investigators believed was meant to be a robbery into a fatal shooting that shocked the surrounding community. Immediately after the gunshot, chaos spread through the quiet suburban lot as Catherine's vehicle lurched forward out of control. The wounded manager remained inside, while the car rolled across the pavement until it struck a nearby fence behind the building. Davis told jurors the teenagers panicked as the scene spiraled beyond the robbery plan they had imagined earlier that evening. According to his testimony, Hamilton rushed back toward the waiting car after firing the shot, while the others prepared to leave immediately. Within seconds, the vehicle carrying the three teenagers pulled away from the restaurant area and disappeared into nearby streets. As they drove away, E. Davis later claimed Hamilton reacted with a mixture of shock and adrenaline while describing what had just happened. During testimony, he told jurors that Hamilton admitted firing the weapon during the attempted robbery. At that moment, the teenagers believed they had escaped the scene before police arrived, while assuming the shooting might only bring investigation later. None of them fully understood the scale of what had occurred in that parking lot until news reports confirmed that Catherine Solinsky Blaine died the following day. In the weeks that followed, detectives slowly gathered evidence while interviewing witnesses connected to the teenagers seen near the restaurant that night. Investigators examined surveillance footage, cell phone records, and statements that gradually placed Jerome Hamilton, Brandon Davis, and DeAndre Sturgis together during the hours leading up to the shooting. Those findings eventually allowed prosecutors to present a timeline showing how three teenagers moved from a failed robbery search to a deadly encounter outside the rib rack. Within little more than a month, police had enough information to bring formal charges against the suspects, placing Jerome Hamilton at the center of a murder case that would soon capture attention across Detroit's court system. After detectives finished building their case, prosecutors in Oakland County moved quickly to file charges against Jerome Hamilton for the killing of Catherine Solinsky Blaine. The decision carried enormous weight since Hamilton was only 15 years old when the shooting happened, yet authorities still charged him with first-degree murder as an adult. That choice meant the teenager faced the same consequences as any grown defendant standing in a Michigan courtroom for a homicide charge. Once the case entered the legal system in late 2008, the story immediately gained attention across Detroit and its surrounding suburbs. News stations ran constant coverage describing how a pregnant restaurant manager had been killed during what investigators believed was a robbery attempt carried out by teenagers. Public interest continued growing as the court scheduled hearings that drew reporters, neighbors, plus Catherine's relatives who wanted answers about the attack that ended her life. The image of a young defendant appearing in court for murder shocked many people across the region since Hamilton still looked like a high school student rather than a hardened criminal. During those early proceedings, prosecutors outlined their theory, explaining how three teenagers attempted to rob the rib rack manager while she closed the restaurant late at night. Within that narrative, they identified Jerome Hamilton as the gunman responsible for firing the fatal shot through the driver's window. That allegation immediately became the center of a legal fight that would stretch across multiple trials. The prosecution's case depended heavily on the testimony of Brandon Davis, who had been riding with Hamilton during the hours leading up to the shooting. Davis eventually reached an agreement with prosecutors allowing him to plead guilty to lesser charges related to the robbery attempt. In exchange, he agreed to testify against Hamilton while explaining exactly how the plan unfolded that night in Lathrop Village. When Davis later took the witness stand, he told jurors that Hamilton approached Catherine Solinsky Blaine's vehicle, while the others remained inside the getaway car waiting nearby. According to Davey, as he heard the gunshot, and then watched Hamilton run back toward the vehicle moments later during their escape from the scene. Although that testimony sounded dramatic inside the courtroom, defense attorneys quickly attacked Davis's credibility while reminding jurors that his plea deal gave him a powerful reason to blame someone else. Lawyers representing Hamilton argued that Davis avoided a murder conviction only by pointing the finger at the teenagers sitting beside them in court. They also emphasized how Davis had changed details in earlier statements given to investigators during the first weeks after the shooting. Those contradictions allowed the defense to suggest that Davis adjusted his story repeatedly while trying to protect himself from serious prison time. As that argument unfolded, the reliability of the prosecution's key witness became one of the central questions facing jurors. Another challenge for prosecutors involved the limited physical evidence connecting Hamilton directly to the crime scene that night. Surveillance cameras positioned near the rib rack parking lot captured portions of the incident, although the images appeared grainy and dark due to the lighting conditions during late evening hours. Investigators showed those recordings during the trial, hoping jurors would connect the moving figures on screen with the testimony provided by Brandon Davis. However, the footage never revealed a clear image of the shooter's face or the weapon used during the attack. Without fingerprints, DNA evidence, or a recovered firearm, the prosecution relied largely on witness statements to support their argument. That reliance created a complicated situation when the first trial began in August 2009 inside Oakland County Circuit Court. Jurors listened carefully as prosecutors presented the story of a robbery attempt that turned deadly outside the Rib Rack restaurant. They also heard Catherine Solinsky Blaine's relatives describe the devastating loss experienced by the family after her death. Yet the defense continued challenging the prosecution's narrative while highlighting gaps in the evidence presented during testimony. After days of deliberation, the jury informed the judge they could not reach a unanimous decision regarding Hamilton's guilt or innocence. The judge declared a mistrial, which meant the case would have to be tried again before another jury. Prosecutors refused to abandon the case after that outcome, so a second trial began in November 2009, with the same central arguments returning to the courtroom. Once again, Brandon Davis described the robbery plan while pointing directly at Jerome Hamilton as the shooter responsible for Catherine's death. Defense attorneys repeated their earlier strategy by questioning Davis's motives while reminding jurors about the missing physical evidence linking Hamilton to the weapon used that night. As deliberations stretched across several days, jurors again struggled to agree on a final verdict. The second trial also ended with a deadlocked jury, forcing the judge to declare another mistrial. By the time prosecutors prepared for a third trial, the case had already stretched across more than 2 years since the shooting occurred. That final courtroom battle began in early 2011, while Jerome Hamilton remained in custody, awaiting another verdict. During this trial, defense attorneys intensified their focus on inconsistencies within witness testimony while raising the possibility that someone else might have fired the gun. They reminded jurors that Brandon Davis initially told investigators an unidentified person could have been responsible for the shot. That earlier statement became central to the defense argument, suggesting investigators rushed to blame Hamilton without proving the accusation beyond doubt. After listening to weeks of testimony, the third jury finally reached a decision that surprised many people following the case across Detroit. Jurors returned a verdict of not guilty for Jerome Hamilton, effectively ending the prosecution's attempt to convict him for Catherine Solinsky Blaine's murder. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the decision, while family members struggled to process the outcome. Catherine's relatives left the courthouse devastated after years spent waiting for justice through the legal system. Meanwhile, E. Jerome Hamilton walked out of court as a free 17-year-old, leaving behind a murder case that had dominated headlines across Michigan for nearly 3 years. When Jerome Hamilton stepped out of the Oakland County Courthouse in 2011 as a free 17-year-old, the decision quickly traveled through Detroit neighborhoods that followed court cases closely. Word moved across the west side faster than most people expected, since young men paid attention whenever someone beat a serious charge inside the system. For many teenagers already drifting towards street culture, Hamilton's acquittal looked less like a legal technicality and more like proof that he stood firm against the state. That perception carried serious weight across Detroit blocks, where reputation often shaped leadership long before money or territory entered the picture. Within weeks, his name circulated through conversations at gas stations, apartment courtyards, plus corner stores along 7 Mile Road. The attention surrounding that courtroom victory gave Hamilton a strange kind of credibility among young men who admired toughness even when it came wrapped inside tragedy. Many teenagers saw the story through a simplified lens, where a suburban kid faced a murder charge, then walked away from it without conviction. That version ignored the pain carried by Catherine Solinsky Blaine's family, while focusing instead on the image of someone surviving the legal system. In neighborhoods where respect often came through surviving dangerous situations, that outcome pushed Hamilton into a new category among peers. Suddenly, people looked at him differently, not simply as Jerome from Southfield, but as someone who carried a story attached to his name. Hamilton seemed to understand how that reputation worked across Detroit streets, so he leaned directly into the identity growing around him. During those months after the trial, he began introducing himself with a tougher nickname that soon stuck across the neighborhood. Friends and younger recruits started calling him Maniac, a name that fit the bold reputation many teenagers already believed about him. The nickname replaced the childhood label Bunchy that relatives still used inside family gatherings. Out on the street, the new name traveled faster since it sounded stronger during introductions or online posts shared among teenagers across the west side. While that identity expanded, Hamilton also strengthened his connection to Crip culture that had fascinated him years earlier while still attending school in Southfield. He began openly claiming affiliation with the Rollin 60s neighborhood Crips, a famous Los Angeles gang known across American street culture for its history and influence. Detroit already carried its own local crews, although Hamilton believed borrowing a California name would instantly give his group recognition. The Rollin 60s image came with blue colors, familiar hand signs, plus a reputation that younger recruits easily understood through music videos and rap lyrics. Hamilton used that recognition as the foundation for organizing a Detroit version of the gang. The earliest members of his crew gathered around neighborhoods near West 7 Mile Road, where several small street groups already operated before Hamilton arrived. Those blocks stretched across the northwest side of Detroit through areas around Tracy Street, Braille Street, plus surrounding residential streets filled with small houses and apartment complexes. Hamilton spent time moving between those corners while building relationships with teenagers looking for belonging inside local crews. Over time, those conversations turned into a structured group, identifying themselves as Rollin 60s Crips, operating inside Detroit rather than Los Angeles. Members started wearing blue clothing more openly while referencing the Rollin 60s name through graffiti, social media posts, plus neighborhood slang. Younger recruits joined steadily as Hamilton's reputation spread through Detroit schools and street circles where teenagers discussed the court case that ended without conviction. Some boys came from nearby blocks along 7 Mile Road, while others arrived from different parts of the city looking for affiliation with a group that appeared organized. Hamilton positioned himself at the center of that activity while appointing close associates to help manage smaller crews within the organization. One young man named Darian Mills soon emerged as a trusted partner who worked closely with Hamilton while helping coordinate daily street operations. Together, they began shaping the group into something larger than a loose collection of friends hanging around neighborhood corners. Over the next few years, as investigators later estimated, the Detroit Rollin 60s grew rapidly as teenagers across the West Side attached themselves to the organization. Federal authorities would eventually describe the gang as having well over 100 members operating across multiple neighborhoods. That number reflected both active participants plus younger recruits who looked up to the older members running the crew. Hamilton's influence expanded alongside that growth while he was barely out of high school. By the time many people his age prepared for college classes, Jerome Hamilton already commanded a street organization spreading across Detroit's northwest side. As the Rollin 60s name spread through Detroit's west side neighborhoods, Jerome Hamilton began shaping the group into something more organized than a loose street crew. He understood that reputation alone would not hold the operation together, so he divided members into smaller neighborhood units that operated around different blocks near 7 Mile Road. Those units often formed around apartment complexes, side streets, or friend groups that already spent time together before joining the gang. Hamilton remained the central figure connecting those smaller crews, giving directions while keeping communication flowing between members across the area. That structure helped the organization move more efficiently across neighborhoods where rival groups watched their activity closely. One of the first people to stand beside Hamilton during those years was Darian Mills, a young man who eventually became one of the most trusted figures within the Rollin 60s operation. Mills grew close to Hamilton during the early expansion of the gang while helping coordinate daily activities across the west side. When Hamilton traveled outside the neighborhood or focused on larger plans, Mills often handled smaller decisions affecting the younger members. Federal prosecutors later described Mills as Hamilton's second in command, which meant he carried authority when giving orders inside the group. That partnership created a clear leadership structure that younger recruits quickly recognized. The organization also included several other figures who managed smaller factions connected to the Rollin 60s identity. Some members controlled activity near Tracy Street, while others worked around Braille Street or nearby blocks along West 7 Mile Road. Hamilton encouraged those crews to represent the gang publicly through clothing, hand signs, plus social media posts showing their affiliation. Photographs began appearing online featuring young men holding firearms while wearing blue colors linked to Crip symbolism. Those posts served two purposes, since they attracted recruits while also warning rival groups that the Rollin 60s were gaining strength across the area. As membership increased, the group expanded beyond symbolic displays into crimes that generated money or influence within Detroit's street economy. Investigators later connected the Rollin 60s to a series of robberies targeting individuals believed to carry cash or valuable property. Carjackings also became part of their activity since stolen vehicles helped members move across neighborhoods without drawing immediate attention. Authorities eventually documented several firearms transactions connected to the crew as well, which meant members sometimes sold weapons or traded them with other individuals inside the city. Those deals strengthened the gang's access to guns while adding another layer to their growing reputation. Drug sales soon became another important piece of the organization's operations, since street-level distribution offered a steady flow of income. Members moved marijuana, prescription pills, plus other substances across several blocks near 7 Mile Road, where customers already gathered regularly. Hamilton encouraged trade while setting rules about how profits moved through the group. Younger members could keep a portion of what they earned, although a share often went towards supporting the broader organization. That system created a small financial structure within the gang that mirrored larger criminal networks operating in other cities. Social media played a surprising role in spreading the Rollin 60s image during those years, since members frequently posted pictures or messages promoting their activities. Photos sometimes showed guns held in front of cameras, while captions referenced neighborhood loyalty or rivalry with other groups. Investigators later studied those posts carefully since they helped track relationships between gang members across Detroit. What looked like casual online bragging actually built a digital record connecting individuals to the Rollin 60s identity. Those posts also attracted recruits who followed the accounts and wanted to join the crew, gaining attention around the West Side. Maintaining control over a growing group required more than money or online presence, so Hamilton encouraged a culture built around loyalty and intimidation. Members understood that disrespect toward the gang could lead to retaliation, while rival groups were expected to face confrontation. Younger recruits often felt pressure to prove commitment by confronting enemies or defending territory connected to the Rollin 60s name. That expectation created a cycle where new members tried to earn recognition through actions that strengthened the gang's reputation. Over time, those confrontations increased tension across neighborhoods where other groups already held influence. Profits generated from robberies, drug sales, or firearm deals helped sustain the organization while covering expenses that came with street operations. Some of that money paid for vehicles used during robberies or travel between neighborhoods controlled by the crew. Funds also helped purchase additional weapons that members carried for protection or intimidation during conflicts. Another portion supported members arrested during smaller police encounters by contributing toward bail payments or legal fees. That financial support reinforced loyalty since recruits saw the organization protecting its own. As those activities expanded and the Rollin 60s began standing out across Detroit's West Side as a rapidly growing group with recognizable leadership, their presence along 7 Mile Road placed them close to territory already claimed by another gang operating nearby. That group called itself the Playboy Gangster Crips, which meant both organizations carried similar identities while competing for influence over the same neighborhoods. The situation created tension almost immediately once Hamilton's crew became visible across those blocks. Within a short time, it became clear that two gangs using the same broader affiliation would not easily share space along Detroit's West Side. While Jerome Hamilton expanded the Rollin 60s across Detroit's West Side, another group already operated along several blocks surrounding 7 Mile Road long before his crew arrived. That organization called itself the Playboy Gangster Crips, often shortened on the street to PGC, while members traced their identity to a California-based gang sharing the same name. Detroit versions of that crew had been active for years around neighborhoods near Laser Road, Evergreen Road, plus several residential blocks stretching west of the territory Hamilton's group entered. Their presence created a complicated situation once the Rollin 60s began building influence nearby. Although both gangs claimed Crip affiliation, shared symbolism never guaranteed cooperation inside Detroit's neighborhood politics. At first, the tension between the two groups showed itself through smaller confrontations, where members exchanged insults, threats, or minor fights across the streets, separating their territories. Young men from each crew regularly crossed paths around gas stations, corner stores, plus apartment courtyards scattered across 7 Mile Road. Those encounters often turned heated once each side realized the other group represented a rival version of Crip identity competing for the same recognition. Disrespect carried serious consequences across neighborhoods where reputation determined survival, which meant even small arguments could quickly escalate into something far more dangerous. Over time, those confrontations began shaping a rivalry that spread through several surrounding blocks. The hostility intensified once both organizations started recruiting younger members, eager to prove loyalty inside their respective crews. Teenagers joining either gang understood that defending territory remained one of the fastest ways to gain recognition among older members. As a result, the early confrontations shifted from shouting matches toward physical fights where individuals tested each other's resolve. Several incidents during those years involved groups gathering near intersections or apartment complexes before arguments turned violent. Police reports later connected many of those disturbances to tensions between the Rollin 60s and the Playboy Gangster Crips. Within a short period, those street fights developed into something far more serious once firearms began appearing during confrontations between the two crews. Investigators later documented multiple shootings across Detroit's west side, where bullets flew through residential blocks after disagreements between members escalated beyond control. Residents living near 7 Mile Road started hearing gunfire late at night or discovering shell casings scattered along sidewalks the following morning. Those incidents created an atmosphere of tension across neighborhoods already struggling with crime. Both gangs believed defending their reputation required retaliation whenever rivals struck first. According to federal prosecutors, Jerome Hamilton eventually encouraged members of the Rollin 60s to respond aggressively whenever Playboy gangster Crips appeared near territory claimed by his organization. Younger recruits interpreted those messages as permission to confront rivals wherever they encountered them across Detroit's northwest side. Investigators later described several drive-by shootings carried out by members of Hamilton's group targeting individuals suspected of affiliation with the Playboys. Those attacks deepened the rivalry while drawing attention from law enforcement agencies monitoring violence across the city. Each incident added another layer of hostility between the two gangs. One of the most significant events connected to that rivalry occurred during August 2011, when a young man named Keontae Atkins was killed during a shooting on Detroit's west side. Authorities later connected Atkins to circles surrounding the Playboy gangster Crips, which meant the attack quickly became part of the ongoing feud between the two organizations. Prosecutors eventually revealed that Jerome Hamilton accepted responsibility for the killing as part of his racketeering activity years later during federal court proceedings. The death of Atkins carried enormous weight inside the conflict since it represented a direct strike against someone associated with the rival crew. That event pushed the tension between the two gangs into an even more dangerous phase. After the killing of Keontae Atkins, the rivalry intensified as both groups responded with additional acts of violence across neighborhoods near 7 Mile Road. Police reports began linking several shootings to individuals believed to be connected to either the Rollin 60s or the Playboy gangster Crips. Residents described hearing gunfire echoing through the area during late evening hours, while patrol officers increased their presence along several streets. Yet arrests rarely brought immediate peace since retaliatory attacks often followed whenever one side suffered losses. That pattern created a cycle where each incident fueled the next. Members from both gangs moved carefully through the neighborhood during those years while watching for rivals who might appear unexpectedly near stores or street corners. Cars sometimes rolled slowly through blocks controlled by opposing crews before shots rang out without warning. Investigators later described how these confrontations spread fear among residents who lived between the two territories. Families raising children along those streets often found themselves caught between groups determined to protect their reputation through violence. Even routine activities like walking to a bus stop or visiting a nearby market carried new risks. As the conflict continued building through the early 2010s, the rivalry between the Rollin 60s and the Playboy gangster Crips started affecting more people than just the young men participating in the feud. Several shootings struck residential blocks where neighbors had nothing to do with the gangs fighting around them. Parents worried constantly about children playing outside, while stray bullets occasionally struck houses or parked vehicles during late-night exchanges. That reality slowly shifted the way Detroit authorities viewed the conflict. What began as a rivalry between two street crews increasingly threatened innocent people living across the west side neighborhoods caught between them. By the middle of the 2010s, the rivalry between the Rollin 60s and the Playboy gangster Crips had already stretched across several years, turning sections of Detroit's west side into territory constantly watched by both crews. Members from each group moved carefully through neighborhoods surrounding 7 Mile Road while remaining alert for rivals appearing near gas stations, apartment courtyards, or corner stores. Police reports during those years began showing an increase in shootings connected to conflicts between the two gangs, with officers regularly responding to gunfire late at night. Residents living in those blocks often described hearing bursts of shots echoing through the streets before patrol cars rushed toward the sound. What started as street confrontations between rival groups gradually evolved into a pattern of retaliatory violence spreading across multiple neighborhoods. As both gangs fought for dominance, the number of shootings rose steadily, while each side tried to prove strength through retaliation. Members believed allowing an attack to go unanswered would weaken their reputation, so every confrontation carried the risk of another violent response soon afterward. That cycle created a situation where even minor disagreements between individuals could quickly escalate into gunfire, involving several people. Police officers investigating those incidents frequently found shell casings scattered along sidewalks or embedded in parked vehicles near residential homes. The conflict had clearly moved beyond isolated arguments into something far more dangerous. The violence reached an especially disturbing moment during 2016, when innocent children became victims caught in the middle of the rivalry. That year, 3-year-old Anaya Montgomery lost her life during a shooting tied to the ongoing conflict between the gangs. The young girl had no connection to the groups fighting across the neighborhood, yet bullets fired during a retaliatory attack struck the area where she was present. News of her death spread rapidly across Detroit, while residents struggled to understand how a gang war could reach a child that young. Community leaders began speaking publicly about the growing dangers surrounding the feud. Only weeks later, another tragedy deepened the shock across the city when 6-month-old Miracle Murray was also killed during a separate shooting connected to retaliation between rival crews. Authorities later described that attack as part of the same chain of violence unfolding along Detroit's west side. The deaths of Anaya Montgomery and Miracle Murray turned what had been an ongoing gang conflict into a crisis that demanded attention far beyond the neighborhoods where it began. Families across Detroit reacted with anger and grief, while news outlets reported extensively on both cases. Many residents felt the city had reached a breaking point. Public outrage grew quickly as community meetings, church gatherings, and neighborhood forums began calling for stronger action against the gangs responsible for the violence. Parents living near 7 Mile Road spoke openly about fear surrounding everyday activities, such as children walking to school or playing outside. Local activists argued that the rivalry between the Rollin 60s and the Playboy gangster Crips had spiraled beyond what city police alone could manage. Those voices pushed for federal involvement that might dismantle the organizations fueling the conflict. Pressure on law enforcement increased steadily as residents demanded visible results. Behind the scenes, investigators had already started building a larger case, targeting the gangs operating across Detroit's west side. Federal agents working with local police quietly gathered information about the Roland 60s organization led by Jerome Hamilton, along with rival crews connected to the Playboy gangster Crips. That investigation examined years of shootings, robberies, drug sales, and other crimes tied to both groups. Evidence collected during those efforts slowly formed the foundation of a broader strategy aimed at dismantling the network responsible for the violence. While the public reacted to tragic headlines in 2016, investigators were already preparing the next move that would soon change everything for Jerome Hamilton and the gang he built. By the time the violence between the Roland 60s and the Playboy gangster Crips reached national headlines during 2016, federal investigators had already spent years quietly building a larger case against the organization Jerome Hamilton controlled. That effort formed part of Operation Detroit 1, a joint task force launched in 2013, bringing together the FBI, ATF, Detroit Police Department, and federal prosecutors. The program focused on violent groups responsible for shootings across the city, especially gangs operating around Detroit's west side neighborhoods. Agents working within that initiative began examining the Roland 60s after several crimes connected to members of the crew appeared in local police reports. Over time, those incidents revealed a pattern suggesting Hamilton's group functioned less like a street clique and more like an organized criminal enterprise. Investigators slowly gathered intelligence through multiple methods that allowed them to track the gang's structure, communication patterns, and daily activities. Confidential informants began speaking with federal agents while sharing information about meetings between members of the Roland 60s scattered across Detroit's northwest neighborhoods. Surveillance teams also monitored locations where gang members frequently gathered, including houses, gas stations, and street corners near 7 Mile Road. At the same time, the agents examined social media accounts belonging to individuals connected with Hamilton's organization. Photos posted online often showed weapons, gang hand signs, and captions referencing retaliation against rivals. Those online posts helped investigators confirm connections between members, while revealing how openly the crew promoted its identity across Detroit. Federal agents later explained that social media records became an important tool when reconstructing the gang's operations. Messages posted on Facebook sometimes included threats directed toward rival crews or discussions about violent incidents occurring in nearby neighborhoods. In some cases, investigators discovered posts where individuals associated with the gang referenced shootings shortly after they happened. Those digital records created a timeline connecting specific people to events already under investigation. As agents gathered information, they also documented numerous crimes tied to members of Hamilton's organization. Those offenses included armed robberies, targeting individuals believed to carry cash, or valuables around Detroit's west side. Investigators also tracked carjackings, where stolen vehicles later appeared in other criminal activities linked to the gang. Drug trafficking formed another major component of the organization's operations, with members distributing marijuana, prescription pills, and other substances across several neighborhoods. The profits generated from those activities supported the purchase of weapons while financing bail payments for arrested members. Federal prosecutors eventually concluded that the Rollin 60s operated as a coordinated enterprise rather than a loose group of individuals acting independently. That determination allowed authorities to pursue charges under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, often called the RICO statute. Under RICO, prosecutors could hold leaders responsible for crimes committed by members acting under the gang's structure. The strategy aimed directly at Jerome Hamilton, along with several close associates believed to help manage operations. Investigators believed the case could dismantle the entire organization rather than arresting individual members one by one. After months of preparation, federal authorities finally moved to act during February 2016, when agents executed coordinated raids targeting individuals connected to the Rollin 60s. Early that morning, law enforcement teams spread across several locations where suspects lived or frequently stayed. Jerome Hamilton was taken into custody along with several other members of the gang during operations carried out in Detroit and other states. The arrest represented the largest law enforcement action against the group since its formation years earlier. Once those suspects entered federal custody, prosecutors quickly unsealed a sweeping indictment outlining nearly a decade of criminal activity tied to the organization. The indictment charged Hamilton and multiple associates with a racketeering conspiracy, along with several violent crimes connected to gang operations. Prosecutors described how the Rollin 60s had built a network involving approximately 150 members spread across different neighborhoods. The document also connected the gang to specific acts, including shootings, robberies, drug trafficking, and the killing of Keontae Atkinson, 2011. Several defendants named in the indictment lived outside Michigan, including individuals located in Alabama, North Carolina, and even Windsor in Canada. That wide reach demonstrated how Hamilton's organization expanded beyond the city where it originally formed. As suspects appeared in federal court following the arrests, the once-growing Rollin 60s network suddenly faced a crisis threatening its survival. Key figures within the organization now sat in detention, while investigators continued building cases against remaining members. Several defendants soon began negotiating plea agreements once they reviewed the evidence gathered by federal agents. The structure Hamilton spent years constructing across Detroit's west side began collapsing as arrests multiplied. What once looked like a powerful street crew now faced dismantling through the federal court system. After the federal indictment placed Jerome Hamilton at the center of a sweeping racketeering case, the legal battle entered a new phase during 2017, when negotiations between prosecutors and defense attorneys began shaping the outcome. Faced with evidence collected through informants, surveillance, plus years of documented criminal activity, Hamilton eventually agreed to enter a plea agreement in federal court. During May 2017, he pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy, along with using a firearm during a violent crime connected to gang operations. As part of that agreement, Hamilton admitted responsibility for the August 2011 killing of Keontae Atkinson, acknowledging the murder as part of the Rollin 60s conflict with rival crews. The plea agreement also carried a moment that surprised many observers who had followed Hamilton's story since the Rib Rack shooting nearly a decade earlier. As part of negotiations, he wrote a letter addressed to the family of Catherine Selinsky Blaine, admitting responsibility for her death during the 2008 robbery attempt. The confession ended years of uncertainty surrounding the case, where a jury previously acquitted him after multiple trials. When the letter was read inside the courtroom, Catherine's mother expressed a mixture of grief and relief after hearing the words she had waited years to receive. Although the legal system could not retry the earlier case, the written confession finally confirmed what many investigators believed happened that night. During January 2018, Jerome Hamilton returned to federal court for sentencing after accepting responsibility for the racketeering charges. The judge ultimately ordered him to serve 30 years in federal prison for his role in leading the Rollin 60s organization and participating in violent crimes tied to the gang. Several of his closest associates also received long prison terms after pleading guilty to related charges connected to robberies, shootings, and drug trafficking. Those sentences effectively dismantled the structure Hamilton once controlled across Detroit's west side neighborhoods. The outcome marked the end of a strange journey that began when a suburban teenager entered court facing murder charges at 15 years old. Years later, that same individual built a street organization, attracting dozens of recruits, before federal investigators dismantled the operation piece by piece. When authorities arrested Jerome Hamilton during the raids described earlier, neighbors watched as the young man known as Maniac disappeared into custody. The streets that once whispered his name eventually watched the story conclude inside a courtroom where the final chapter unfolded.